I'm originally from California, and so that's where I went to high school. And I lived near San Francisco, so when I graduated, in fact, for me, the local school was UC Berkeley. I really actually formed an intellectual foundation that I could build on. And I developed a curiosity for things that has remained with me. Those were good, okay? And I maintained a GPA high enough that I actually had an option to get to graduate school. You probably all have pretty good GPAs since you're here. I was actually not that stellar of a student, but it was good enough. I was a B student. The bad. Okay, there was bad stuff too. I can't remember most of the courses I took, all right? I spent 4 years at university. I'd have a hard time telling you more than a handful. That's the way it is. Halfway through my junior year, I realized I didn't like my major, okay? I had two choices. I could start with a new major, or I could just suck it up and finish this one, and then kind of use my time to figure things out a little bit more. I really didn't like the idea of going back and starting over. That would cost a lot of money and take time, and it would keep me in school. So I went ahead and just kind of sucked it up. And so what I did, though, was I decided I would then take what the classes that I had as electives left to kind of explore other things that I might be interested in. So I tried to use my time well. Okay, then there was some real ugly, okay? I nearly failed a course simply because I didn't like it. So I just stopped going. So I didn't take the tests. So I nearly flunked out. And then I also nearly failed another course for all the wrong reasons. I took a course because it fit my schedule. And another friend said, "You'll like this course." I didn't realize he was a rhetoric major and I was a landscape architecture major. And so I had to read 18th century New England sermons like Calvin and stuff like that. So I fell asleep in class every day. The class was at 2:30 in the afternoon, right? Which is kind of the same as nap time. Every day I'd get into class, and the next thing I knew, everyone was getting up and leaving. But I graduated, and I got into graduate school despite all those things, and eventually I found a major that I liked. So just note that your path is not always very straight. So there were certain epiphanies I had, certain kind of aha moments, okay, that stand out to me even 35 years afterwards, okay? The day I actually understood, I was in landscape architecture, the day I actually understood what I was doing. I actually remember that day because I was in courses for 2 years not having a clue what I was doing. We were taking design classes, I would get a grade, but I really didn't know. One day I actually got it. That really stood out. The day I decided to use my university experience to explore all the interesting courses I could find on campus. I had some courses free. So I took art history classes. I took, I think I mostly took art history. I took some music classes. I took some things that were outside of my field, and it was really useful because it gave me an education about what else there was outside of my major. And the day I also realized that if I ever did really figure out what I wanted to do, I could return and I could focus in on that for graduate school. So I did that. I went to graduate school 10 years later. So in between, when I got out, I did things that you like to do. It's just part of your life. I went and I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail with some friends. I worked on a potato farm. 2 months driving a tractor convinced me I did not want to be a farmer. That was 2 months really well spent, okay? That wasn't even a whole semester, right? And I figured out this is not for me. I worked for a regional park district. I worked for the Forest Service. I was unemployed in Denver, not in Greenland. Okay. I worked construction, right? So these were all things that I was interested in, so I thought, why not go do it and see? I didn't stay in construction. I love construction. I hated the people I worked with. I didn't want to spend my entire life talking to these people. So I realized as much as I liked that work, my colleagues really mattered to me. So I had enough in construction business. I went and helped a friend build a home. Then I drove a bus for Alpine Meadows one winter because I wanted to ski, right? And I went back and worked for the Forest Service again, which eventually, then I got married and I traveled around the world some, right? That was good. And then I worked for a conservation corps. And finally, 9 years later, while working for the conservation corps, I was just getting contracts, right? Because I had this construction background. But on Friday afternoons, they had an environmental education program, and the students there were your age or a few years older. And I realized I liked working with this group, and I liked the whole idea of the environment and educating around the environment. So from that, I decided that I would then go back to graduate school in some environmental field so that I could get into education. But it took me 9 years to figure that out after my undergraduate degree. So just remember that you know, this is a journey. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You know, you need to pace yourself. It's a long way down the road. And so it turned out that all of those experiences came in really handy because I ended up doing field type geography, and it really helps that I know how to build things and I'm comfortable out in the environment. So for me, all that stuff actually ended up being pretty useful. So I went back to Berkeley because we happened to be living in the Bay Area at the time, and it was still a good school. So I got a master's and a PhD in geography in Berkeley, and my focus there was reconstructing environmental change. And the interesting thing is, I ended up doing it by what sounds like an absolutely miserable way to spend your days. I used to do this more, I do it less now. Sit at a microscope and I count pollen slides, okay? So, turned out that in graduate school, you get a mentor who's a faculty that you are assigned to. And I was really interested in environmental history, but it turned out that my mentor, his specialty was looking at pollen to reconstruct past environments. So I had to take his class. So I took his class. And at the end of the class, I said, I am never going to do that again. So I went along and I did other things. And I got my master's, and I'm looking, I wanted to actually go to India and work on issues of deforestation. I actually studied Hindi for 2 years to try and learn the language so I could go over there. But I had a young family, and for a variety of reasons, it looked like I wasn't going to be able to get to India. And an opportunity came along for some funding to stay in California and work on my PhD, and the funding required that I do pollen analysis. And I'd already sworn that I would never go back and do that. But I thought, I know how to do it. It was all on a subject I knew all about. I could probably write this and get the money, and it would pay for the rest of my dissertation. So I did it. And in fact, I actually learned to really enjoy it. So it turned out that I'd rather count pollen than watch TV, okay? So I did that, okay? And I got my PhD, and I arrived at UNR in 1993, okay? And I had come from Berkeley, and I learned a lot of things about teaching too. Like the first semester, I just completely demolished the students because I thought they were all PhD students from Berkeley. So I learned a lot because, you know, on the first test, everybody flunked. It's like, okay, maybe that wasn't a good test. So there was a process even, you know, once I got in my career thinking, okay, great, I've done all this. I'm supposed to know what I'm doing. I really didn't know what I'm doing. So what have I learned? Okay, so some of the things that I just do, try and keep the standards high. I find that the students do better when more is expected from them. What I learned here was just not go super fast so that you're kind of racing out in front of them, but keep your standards really high. Be patient. A lot of students learn in a lot of different ways. You probably all know that. Have mercy. Okay, so remember one of those classes I almost flunked. I should have flunked. But for the final, at the last test, in those days, nothing was electronic, sorry. And so you would give a postcard to the instructor to get your grade. So we were going to Christmas vacation, and I gave him a postcard to ask for my grade. And I wrote on the postcard, I really need this class to graduate. If I'm anywhere close to passing, could you please have mercy and give me a pass? And then I went home, right? And over Christmas vacation, this postcard comes. I'm actually terrified to turn it over and look at it. And it says P for pass. And underneath it says, an act of mercy. I don't think I would have graduated without that. So that's something that I always remember, that school's just one part of your life, right? And so everyone here is living and doing all these other things. So it's good to remember that yourself too. It's an important part, but it's just one part. And even good students can struggle. They might be really good in one subject, but they might really not be good in another. So I've learned all that about students. So I always suggest really, follow your interests. If it's something you really like, make sure you pursue that. Even if you can't tell where it's going, even if your parents, don't listen parents, even if your parents think that you really should be in something that's more vocational, that'll actually get you a job, in the long run, I think it's really important to do what you really like. When you're at university, make sure you get to know your instructors. That's where education really happens, that one-on-one. It doesn't happen sitting in a lecture hall. Not really, right? It's that kind of interaction between your teacher that's going to make a difference. And when possible, pick your courses by an instructor. A good instructor can make a boring subject interesting. A boring instructor can make an interesting subject really dull. So pay attention to that when you are kind of eventually there. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about kind of the work that I do, and then we'll go over and we'll do a little bit of it, do a little exploration. So I reconstruct past environments. So my interest is in knowing how the world was in the past. And that's a combination of two things. It's what was the physical environment like, and how did it impact the people, and how were the people impacting it. And so for the last few years, I've been working in Italy, okay? And one of the reasons I like being over here is that there are written records, beginning with the Romans, and then going through the monasteries with the monks, and then into the medieval communities. They wrote things down, and so they've been writing things down for 2,000 years. And so I work with historians who read the written record, and I then go get a physical record of what's going on in the environment. And I reconstruct what I think is going on, and then the historians tell me what they think is going on based on what they read, and then we compare them to see how they fit, okay? And so what we do is we work on these little floating platforms, and I've got this instrument where it allows me to just push it into the mud and essentially take back a core. And the cores are sitting out here, so we'll deal with some of those. And then I take them into the lab. You see, I'm really happy because this is a really nice core. It's really interesting. There's all kinds of things going on. It's very long. There's lots of cores. So this is history. This is history being written, okay? And then this is what I'm looking at, okay? And so I have a handout where you'll each have some of these that you'll identify in the microscopes, and then you'll be able to say, oh, this is not just some funny little round thing with a hole in it. You'll say, oh, this is grass pollen. And so if this is grass pollen, then this must have been a pasture. It wasn't a forest. And if it was a pasture and it happens to be medieval time, what that means is that they were cutting or trimming the trees and bringing a lot of animals on here, and it was a really different environment than it is today when you don't find those pastures. That's the story we're trying to kind of get at. So, so this is pretty ugly. But essentially, what I'm showing you here is the way my data get presented, okay? This is called a pollen diagram. There's a couple of things. Over here, it goes how deep, okay? And so this is showing down about 660 centimeters, 6 meters, 6.5 meters, okay? 20 feet. So there's a lot of mud here. And then over here, I have figured out how old it is. It goes back about 1,000 years, okay? And then every one of these is a different plant that tells us something about the environment. For example, right here, this is pollen from corn, okay? This is pollen from corn in Italy. Does that mean anything to you? What does it mean, Lucas?
It's when Europe got corn from the Americas after the...
Exactly. Europe got corn from the Americas. So we can go to the history and say, when did they start planting corn here? And we can use that to help us figure out exactly what's going on here, okay? And there's another interesting one. That's cannabis. Does that mean anything to you? What is this? What plant is that? What's its common name? Maybe I shouldn't tell them. This is marijuana. Except it's not actually marijuana. It's also hemp. This is produced for rope, okay? So there's two different types of this plant. One is marijuana and the other is hemp. And it's used for making rope, okay? So we don't think about that so much, but from 1600 to 1840, rope was really important. Why? Who cares? Who needed rope?
Sailors.
Exactly. Sailors. What were they doing?
Traveling across the ocean.
Traveling across the ocean. From kind of where to where?
Between Europe and Africa and the Americas.
Between Europe and the Americas. They were getting all the way over to Australia, right? And if you've ever been on a sailing ship, it needs thousands of feet of rope. This is the period of discovery. So we know when we see all of this stuff here, oh my gosh, this is a historical event as well. So we see things that help us correspond with the historical record to know what's going on. And so eventually, we work this all the way through. We have all these funny little lines. We have these terrible colors because this projector really is weird. And what we know is we've got a period that's pre-Roman, and then we've got a period that goes into the Roman time, and then we go into a period that's medieval, and here's the Black Plague. And what's really interesting is, okay, I'm going to move. So this actually represents trees, and we can see during medieval time, there was very few trees and a whole bunch of grass. And some other things that show us that there was a lot of grazing going on, they were cutting forest, there was a population expansion. If you ever, has any of you ever been to Europe? Not yet. Okay, so if you go, you have to go to a Gothic cathedral, okay? All Gothic cathedrals were built between 1150 and 1300 AD. All of the big ones, all right during this really interesting time when there was more people on the landscape, and it was warmer, and it was nice, and they were advancing and really having an impact on the landscape. And then 1348, Black Plague. Do you remember what that is, Black Plague? Could you think what it is? Make something up.
Epidemic.
Yeah, an epidemic, okay? And what usually happens? Yeah. Davidson, number 4.
Like half of Europe died.
Yeah, half of Europe died. That's kind of a big event, okay? If that happened today, it would probably make the newspapers, okay? So what's really interesting is in this place, only 40% of them died. It was kind of not so bad, okay? But they all die, and so what we can see is that we stop having all this grass, and the trees all come back. And so the forest comes back. So we can see the history written in this reconstruction. And so that's pretty much kind of what we try and do. And then we try and compare it with the socio-ecologic history of what people were doing and why that might have happened that way. Okay, so I only brought this in because recently I was giving a presentation down at DePauli, and even here in Reno, you might not notice it so much, but there's been huge changes in the land. And these days, we're able to track it by aerial maps, but we can't always do that. So we can even try and reconstruct the history of our own backyards here. So here we see, this is where DePauli High School is, and there's Virginia Street. You notice there's no freeway, okay? And so then, 1994, a couple of years later, now they're finally building the freeway. And so we've got, this is all just from Google Earth, the timeline. And so you can pull it down and you can see how, as you go by years, you get this construction. And see, there's a little pond here. We could take a core out of that pond and begin seeing this stuff happening. And so go on, 2003, and there's a whole bunch more houses here. DePauli High School, middle school is still not there. Now the middle school's there, I think. It's kind of burned out here, but you can see the neighborhood coming in, and then eventually you get more construction over here, et cetera, and they're preparing here in 2010, surrounding all this area, and even by 2014, there's all these places built, but because of the recession, they didn't get built out, but there's more that's going to happen. And so we, on a short time frame, can see these kinds of things. But my goal is to try and give us a longer depth, because things that have happened in the past are really important in terms of our history, about how we understand, and sometimes they can give us an indication of what might happen off in the future. Okay, that's my story. So the handouts for we don't need the pollen handouts just yet. I guess we'll start with coming over here. So we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to get our hands dirty. Then we'll use the microscopes. That's, of course, the wrong order, but that's how we're going to do it. So I've got 5 tables laid out here with sediment cores. So why don't we just mosey over here, and everybody go to a table, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do from there. What I want you to do is look for any changes you see in the sediments in either color or texture or grain size. Every time you see it change, what do you think that means? Something in the landscape changed, okay? Every time there's a change in the sediments, that means something in the landscape changed. So from just looking at these, I want you to then start creating a story of what might have happened. Yeah, so what's that?
Like red sand.
Okay. Why do you think it's red?
Because it has kind of a red thickness.
Could that be iron?
That would be my first guess, right?
Yeah.
That this has a certain amount of iron in it that's oxidized, right? What else do you notice? There are some changes.
The grain seems to become finer towards
Finer over here, definitely.
Yeah,
Finer
towards
towards
this
this
side.
end.
Finer here and coarser down here.
Yeah,
so we think that's probably
product erosion. Yeah.
Okay. Which would have more erosion, the fine or the
Fine.
coarse?
Absolutely.
Okay. And what would be eroding?
Just rocks. You're going to be getting smaller.
Well, if we had gravel here, what would that mean?
Well, I guess that would be a sign of something that's newer, so it would have eroded less.
Or does that mean it erodes, something coarser is eroding and moving in?
That could be it too.
Okay, right? You know, this is probably, if I know this core, about 500 years.
Wow. Really?
Yeah, it's a lot of time. It takes a long time for this stuff to build up in the Sierra Nevada. But once you have plants, this is all now peat. And so it's plants that are essentially just decomposing. And so, but then something happened here, right?
Yes.
So that this is probably all plants, and then you get this kind of less organic, sandy stuff. There's a lot of rocks in this one, right? As a matter of fact, look at that. That's a giant chunk of gravel. That's really interesting. How'd that get there? This is all a meadow up in the mountains.
Maybe there was some sort of natural, something that,
Like when the earth moves, no?
Okay.
like something like let's say there's like just rocks and then like water comes over it.
Yes, that's probably exactly right. Some big flood event or the stream moved or something, right? Because you don't get big rocks out there for normally. Normally it was this really fine stuff, but some big event happened here. If we knew enough, we could figure out what it was, but we don't know right now. Let's move over to the microscopes, and let's just have a little chat before we sit down, okay? The goal here is to train your eye to see, first of all, you'll look into the scope, and you'll compare what you're seeing in the scope with the pictures to make sure you know which type of pollen you're looking at. And then there's a picture of the plant that it represents, so you have some sense of its environment, okay? And so once you think you know what your pollen slide looks like, the other one is out of the mud. It's just what it looks like if you take the mud and process it and you get fossil pollen. See if you can find all of these different things, okay? Do you have a grass there? Do you see the pore? Yeah. Yeah, that's the key. Okay. Sometimes, they're a little folded, a little smashed. The key is if you see the one pore, then you've got it. Okay? Most of these have a lot of pine. Okay, there's some pines in here. And, okay, so look it. You've got a lot of really interesting things in here. Okay. So come over and look in here. There's at least 3 other things. There's pine, and there's a couple of other types. Okay? So look in there and see, from even just looking at the pictures, which ones you can figure out. Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, so this is Pediastrum. This is an algae. Okay? And this is Pediastrum cornutum. This is one that it grows in kind of relatively warmish water. Center, just below the needle. What was that with all the holes? Nope. It's a saltbush, exactly. You forget. Maybe we'll wrap up just a brief discussion about kind of what you saw. Okay. What's one thing that you kind of came across or saw or learned about or thought about that's new tonight that you hadn't thought about before? Anything from the whole evening? How pollen looks, right? We don't usually see it, right? We usually see it as this yellow dust on the windshield kind of a thing. Okay. What are some other things? Well, I have a really hard time hearing that. Oh, okay, so there's a lot of different kinds. It turns out that every terrestrial plant produces pollen, and a lot of them are distinguishable from each other. So it's actually pretty effective, but I can't tell one grass from another grass. So if it's grass, it's grass, it's grass. But I like this, but I don't just do it for fun, okay? There's a question that I want to answer, and in order to answer the question, I need to go through this process. And so if you really want to understand kind of about how the environment changes, this is one way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. There's other ways to do it. Geologists do it by taking cores and looking at how the rocks change. Geochemists do it by looking at the chemistry. And as we learned, historians do it by reading. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, and so sometimes we just work together. Yeah. It's how one core represents so many years. I've got some cores where in a meter it's 200 years, and that's really fast. I have other cores where in a meter it's actually 2,000 years. Lake Tahoe has almost no sediment. If you take a meter of mud out of Lake Tahoe, it will be 2,000 years because that's a really clean lake, right? So it's just not producing a lot. But these are actually the lakes where I take these things out of, or well, they're meadows too, but the lakes, you probably wouldn't want to swim in them. They're not that pleasant. But there's a lot of algae in there and a lot of productivity, and so it actually makes a good record. So they're lousy for swimming, but they're great for doing environmental research. Okay, cool. Thanks so much.